Before most of history, the world knew this land by one name, Persia. It was the empire of kings and conquerors, of golden palaces, vast deserts, fire temples, and armies that once ruled nearly half the known world. Greek historians wrote about it with awe and fear. Ancient maps carved its name across Asia. Its poets, scientists, and warriors shaped civilizations for thousands of years. And then, Persia disappeared. In its place appeared another name, Iran. Today, millions of people use the two names interchangeably, while others believe they are entirely different countries. Some associate Persia with the ancient world and Iran with the modern state. Others wonder why one of history's greatest civilizations seemed to vanish from the map almost overnight. But the truth is far more complicated. Because Persia never truly disappeared. The story of Persia becoming Iran is not simply a political decision made in the 20th century. It is a journey stretching back thousands of years, through forgotten empires, invasions, religion, conquest, survival, and identity itself. Long before modern borders existed, powerful civilizations rose upon the Iranian plateau. Empires expanded across deserts and mountains. Kings claimed divine authority beneath golden palaces. Great cities flourished with science, poetry, astronomy, and trade. Then came war. Alexander the Great. Arab conquerors. Mongol invasions. Foreign dynasties. Revolutions. Each wave reshaped the land, yet something ancient continued to survive beneath the surface. Even when empires collapsed. Even when cities burned. Even when the world stopped calling it Persia. The civilization endured. This is not merely the story of a changing name. It is the story of how memory survives conquest, how identity survives empire, and how one of humanity's oldest civilizations transformed across millennia without ever truly disappearing. Tonight, we journey into the forgotten heart of ancient Persia, to uncover how Persia became Iran, and why the world still remembers both names to this day. Long before the world knew the name Persia, before mighty kings built golden palaces and imperial armies crossed continents, there existed a vast and unforgiving land shaped by mountains, deserts, and ancient rivers. This was the Iranian plateau, a massive region stretching across rugged highlands, dry salt deserts, fertile valleys, and trade routes that connected the civilizations of Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. For thousands of years, the plateau stood at the crossroads of the ancient world. Caravans carrying precious goods moved across its harsh landscapes. Nomadic tribes wandered beneath endless skies. Small farming settlements emerged beside rivers and mountain foothills. Survival here demanded resilience. The environment itself shaped the people who would one day build some of history's greatest empires. Among the earliest civilizations to flourish in this region were the Elamites, whose kingdom rose in southwestern Iran thousands of years before the Persian Empire existed. Their cities, temples, and trade networks connected them to neighboring Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians and Babylonians dominated the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Elamites developed their own language, culture, and religious traditions. Powerful kings ruled from cities like Susa, which would later become one of the great capitals of Persian rulers. For centuries, Elamite kingdoms fought wars, forged alliances, and competed for influence with the mighty powers surrounding them. But beyond the cities and fertile valleys, another transformation was slowly unfolding. Across the great Eurasian steppes, groups of Indo-Iranian tribes began migrating southward into the Iranian plateau. These peoples spoke early Indo-European languages and lived as semi-nomadic herders and warriors. Over generations, they settled across the region, blending with local populations and shaping the foundations of what would eventually become Iranian civilization. Among these migrating peoples emerged tribes known as the Medes and the Persians. At first, they were not emperors. They lived in scattered tribal communities divided among mountains and plains, raising livestock, defending territory, and following ancient traditions passed through generations. Tribal chiefs ruled local clans, while oral storytelling preserved their history and beliefs. Religion during this early period remains partly mysterious, but many scholars believe the roots of ancient Iranian spirituality were already beginning to form. The natural world held sacred meaning. Fire symbolized purity. The sky, sun, and cosmic order carried spiritual importance. These early beliefs would eventually influence Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest known monotheistic religions and a faith that would profoundly shape Persian identity for centuries. Life upon the Iranian plateau was often harsh. Winters in the mountains could be brutal. Deserts stretched endlessly across the landscape. Rival tribes competed for resources and territory. Yet these conditions also forged resilient warrior cultures capable of surviving in some of the ancient world's most difficult environments. Gradually, tribal alliances grew stronger. Small kingdoms emerged. Fortified settlements expanded. The Medes established themselves in the northwestern regions of the plateau, while the Persians settled farther south in an area that would later become known as Pars, the land that eventually gave birth to the name Persia itself. At this stage, however, the Persians were still relatively unknown. Greater powers dominated the ancient Near East. The Assyrian Empire ruled through fear and military strength. Mesopotamian kingdoms controlled trade and wealth. Egypt remained one of the world's most powerful civilizations. But deep within the mountains and deserts of the Iranian plateau, change was coming. The scattered tribes of the Medes and Persians were slowly evolving into organized political powers. Their warriors learned from the empires around them. Their leaders forged alliances. Their identity strengthened through shared culture, language, and belief. And though the world did not yet realize it, the foundations of one of history's greatest empires were already being laid. Soon, from these rugged lands of mountains and fire, a ruler would emerge whose name would echo across history forever. A king who would unite tribes, overthrow empires, and transform the Persians from scattered peoples into masters of the ancient world. His name was Cyrus. Long before the Persian Empire rose to dominate the ancient world, another people emerged from the mountains of the Iranian plateau and laid the foundations of Iranian civilization itself. They were known as the Medes, fierce horsemen, tribal warriors, and rulers of what many historians consider the first great Iranian empire. At first, the Medes were not united. They lived in scattered tribes across the rugged Zagros mountains of northwestern Iran, surrounded by dangerous enemies and powerful empires. Assyrian armies raided their lands repeatedly. Scythian nomads attacked from the north. Rival clans fought among themselves for survival and territory. Life upon the plateau demanded strength, endurance, and constant vigilance. But pressure from foreign powers slowly forced the Median tribes toward unity. According to ancient traditions recorded by Greek historians, a leader named Deioces began bringing order to the fragmented Median clans. He established authority among the tribes and eventually founded a capital city known as Ecbatana, a heavily fortified royal center surrounded by mountains. Though much about the Medes remains mysterious, one truth is clear: they were becoming stronger. Generation after generation, the Median tribes evolved from scattered communities into a growing political and military power. Their warriors became feared across the region. They mastered cavalry warfare and adapted tactics from nomadic cultures of the Eurasian steppes. Ancient sources describe the Medes as exceptional horsemen capable of striking enemies with speed and brutality. At this time, the greatest power in the Near East was the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians ruled through terror. Their armies destroyed cities, enslaved populations, and crushed rebellions with ruthless efficiency. Massive palaces decorated with scenes of war glorified Assyrian kings as masters of the ancient world. But even mighty empires eventually weaken. By the 7th century BCE, Assyria faced growing internal instability and increasing pressure from enemies on all sides. The Medes recognized an opportunity. Under the leadership of King Cyaxares, the Medes transformed into a major imperial force. He reorganized the military, strengthened alliances, and expanded Median influence across the Iranian plateau. Then came the war that changed the ancient world forever. The Medes formed an alliance with the Babylonians against Assyria. Together, their armies launched devastating campaigns against the weakening empire. In 612 BCE, the allied forces attacked Nineveh, the magnificent Assyrian capital. The city that once terrified nations fell into flames. Ancient chronicles describe brutal destruction, collapsing walls, and the complete downfall of Assyria's imperial power. With Assyria destroyed, the balance of power across the Near East shifted dramatically. The Medes suddenly controlled vast territories stretching across much of Iran and beyond. For the first time in history, an Iranian people stood among the great powers of the ancient world. Their capital, Ecbatana, became a center of royal authority, wealth, and military power. Ancient writers describe the city as magnificent, protected by enormous walls and filled with royal treasures. Yet despite their growing empire, the Medes remained strangely shadowed in history. Unlike later Persian rulers, they left behind relatively few written records of their own. Much of what we know about them comes from outsiders: Assyrian inscriptions, Babylonian chronicles, and Greek historians writing generations later. Still, their influence upon Iranian history was immense. The Medes established systems of kingship, military organization, and imperial rule that later Persian rulers would inherit and expand. Their court traditions, noble structures, and political models helped shape the empire that would soon rise beneath a new dynasty. Because within the Median Empire lived another Iranian people quietly growing in strength: the Persians. At first, they existed under Median influence, ruling smaller territories farther south in the land of Pars. But among them emerged a prince whose ambition would transform world history forever. His name was Cyrus. And soon, the Persians would overthrow their former masters and build an empire greater than anything the Medes had ever imagined. From the rugged lands of southern Iran, beneath the shadow of the Median Empire, a new ruler began to rise, a man whose name would echo across history as one of the greatest conquerors and kings the world had ever known. His name was Cyrus. Born among the Persians in the region of Pars, Cyrus inherited not a mighty empire, but a smaller kingdom living under Median dominance. Yet ancient traditions surrounding his birth already carried the language of destiny. Legends claimed kings dreamed of his future greatness long before he took the throne. Whether myth or history, one truth would soon become undeniable: Cyrus was different from the rulers who came before him. At the time, the ancient Near East was divided among powerful civilizations. The Medes ruled much of Iran. Babylon controlled Mesopotamia with immense wealth and ancient prestige. Lydia dominated parts of Anatolia with rich trade networks and legendary treasures. Egypt remained powerful along the Nile. Most kings conquered through fear. Empires rose through destruction, slavery, and terror. But Cyrus would build something different. Around the middle of the 6th century BCE, Cyrus rebelled against the Median king Astyages. What began as an uprising quickly transformed into revolution. Many Median nobles and soldiers joined Cyrus, dissatisfied with Astyages' rule. The Median Empire weakened from within, and eventually Cyrus captured the Median capital itself. Instead of destroying the Medes, however, Cyrus absorbed them into his growing empire. This decision would define the future of Persia. Rather than ruling only as a tribal conqueror, Cyrus began creating a multicultural imperial system unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. Medes and Persians governed together. Local traditions were often respected. Conquered peoples were not always erased. Many became part of the empire itself. With Media under his control, Cyrus turned westward. His armies marched into the kingdom of Lydia, ruled by the wealthy king Croesus, whose riches had become legendary across the ancient world. After fierce battles, Lydia fell beneath Persian control. Its treasuries, cities, and trade routes strengthened Cyrus's expanding empire even further. But the conquest that truly transformed Cyrus into a global figure came with Babylon. At the time, Babylon stood among the greatest cities on earth. Its massive walls towered above the plains of Mesopotamia. Temples rose toward the heavens. Markets overflowed with wealth gathered from across the ancient world. For centuries, Babylonian kings had ruled one of humanity's oldest centers of civilization. Yet in 539 BCE, Cyrus entered Babylon almost without resistance. Ancient records suggest many within the city welcomed him. The last Babylonian king had become unpopular, and Cyrus presented himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator chosen by divine will. Unlike many conquerors before him, Cyrus did not burn Babylon to the ground. He restored temples, allowed displaced peoples to return home, respected local religions, and presented himself as protector rather than tyrant. One artifact from this period would later become famous throughout the world: the Cyrus cylinder. Inscribed in ancient cuneiform, the cylinder described Cyrus restoring order and honoring local traditions after conquering Babylon. Some modern historians even describe it as one of the earliest expressions of imperial tolerance and human rights, though debates about its interpretation continue today. Regardless of interpretation, Cyrus's reputation spread rapidly. To many conquered peoples, he appeared not merely as a conqueror, but as a king capable of mercy. Under Cyrus, the empire expanded across enormous territories stretching from Central Asia to Mesopotamia and beyond. Roads connected distant regions. Trade flourished. Diverse peoples became linked beneath one imperial system. And slowly, The outside world began identifying this vast empire by the name of one particular people: the Persians. This naming largely came through the Greeks. The Greeks encountered the empire through its ruling dynasty, which originated from the Persian homeland of Pars. To them, the empire became known as Persia, and its rulers as Persians, even though the empire itself contained many cultures, languages, and ethnic groups across enormous territories. This Greek perspective would shape Western memory for thousands of years. The name Persia spread across maps, histories, and civilizations. Yet within the empire itself, identity remained more complex. The rulers viewed themselves as kings over many peoples and lands united beneath imperial authority. The foundations of Iranian identity were already forming, though the modern word Iran would not officially dominate until centuries later. Still, under Cyrus, the world witnessed the birth of something extraordinary: the Achaemenid Empire. An empire larger than any the world had previously seen. An empire built not only through conquest, but through administration, diplomacy, cultural integration, and vision. By the end of Cyrus's reign, the Persians had transformed from a regional people into masters of the ancient world. But Cyrus's story would not end peacefully. During campaigns in Central Asia, the great king was killed in battle far from the imperial capitals he created. Legends surrounding his death vary, but his legacy survived long after him. Future generations remembered him as Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, the king who reshaped the ancient world, and the ruler whose empire caused the name Persia to echo across human history forever. After the death of Cyrus the Great, the empire he created did not collapse into chaos as many ancient kingdoms often did. Instead, it continued expanding, transforming into the largest and most powerful empire the world had yet seen. This was the golden age of the Achaemenid Empire. Stretching from the Indus Valley in the east to the shores of the Mediterranean in the west, the Persian Empire ruled over millions of people across 3 continents. Mountains, deserts, rivers, forests, and ancient cities all fell beneath the authority of the great king. No empire before it had united so much of the known world under one system. At the center of this transformation stood Darius I, remembered by history as Darius the Great. Unlike Cyrus, who built the empire through conquest, Darius perfected it through organization. He divided the empire into provinces known as satrapies, each governed by appointed officials called satraps. Taxes were standardized. Laws were enforced across vast territories. Messengers traveled along royal roads carrying information between distant cities at astonishing speed for the ancient world. One route became legendary: the Royal Road. Stretching thousands of kilometers across the empire, it connected major cities and administrative centers from Anatolia to the Persian heartland. Mounted couriers could transport royal messages across enormous distances in days rather than weeks. The Persian Empire became a machine of administration unlike anything humanity had previously witnessed. Trade flourished beneath imperial protection. Merchants crossed borders safely. Cultures exchanged ideas, languages, and technologies. Under Persian rule, diversity itself became part of imperial strength. The empire contained Egyptians, Babylonians, Phoenicians, Jews, Greeks, Medes, Persians, and countless other peoples living beneath one imperial system. Rather than forcing complete cultural destruction, the Persians often allowed local traditions and religions to survive. This flexibility helped stabilize the empire across enormous territories. Meanwhile, deep within Persia itself, Darius began constructing one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world: Persepolis. Built upon a massive stone terrace surrounded by mountains, Persepolis was not merely a capital, it was a symbol of imperial power. Enormous columns towered toward the sky. Staircases displayed carvings of delegates from every corner of the empire bringing tribute to the great king. Gold, silver, precious textiles, exotic animals, and treasures from distant lands flowed into the royal courts. The city embodied the wealth and authority of the Persian Empire at its height. Religion also played an increasingly important role within imperial identity. Many scholars believe the Achaemenid rulers were influenced by the teachings of Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian faith associated with the prophet Zoroaster. The religion emphasized cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, order and chaos, good and evil. Fire temples, sacred rituals, and concepts of moral responsibility shaped Persian spiritual culture for centuries. Yet while Persia flourished, tension slowly grew between the empire and the independent Greek city-states to the west. The Greeks viewed the Persian Empire with fascination, fear, and hostility. To them, Persia represented immense wealth and overwhelming imperial power. Greek merchants traded with Persian territories, But political conflict became increasingly unavoidable as Persian influence expanded into regions near Greece itself. Eventually, rebellion erupted among Greek cities in Asia Minor against Persian rule. The Persians responded with military force. And soon, conflict between Greece and Persia transformed into one of history's most famous rivalries. In 490 BCE, Persian forces under Darius launched an invasion of mainland Greece. At Marathon, heavily armed Greek hoplites shocked the Persians with an unexpected victory. Years later, Darius's son Xerxes would attempt another massive invasion. Ancient writers described enormous Persian armies crossing bridges over the sea itself as they marched toward Greece. Then came Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass where Spartan king Leonidas and his warriors made their legendary final stand against Xerxes' invading forces. Though the Persians ultimately won the battle, Greek storytellers transformed Thermopylae into a symbol of resistance against overwhelming power. Later came Salamis and Plataea, battles that halted Persian expansion into mainland Greece. Militarily, the Persian Empire remained enormously powerful after these wars. But culturally, something far more important had begun to happen. The Greeks started shaping the way future Western civilizations would remember Persia forever. Greek historians like Herodotus wrote detailed accounts of the Greco-Persian Wars. Their stories portrayed the conflict as a struggle between freedom and despotism, between small democratic Greek states and the vast monarchy of Persia. For many later Western civilizations, these Greek narratives became the foundation of how Persia was understood. Persian kings were often depicted as extravagant, authoritarian, and decadent. Greek courage and independence became glorified. And over centuries, this Greek lens deeply influenced Western memory of ancient Persia. Yet reality was far more complicated. The Persian Empire was not merely a land of tyrants and conquest. It was one of history's greatest administrative achievements. A civilization of roads, architecture, trade, diplomacy, religion, and cultural integration. An empire that connected much of the ancient world together long before modern globalization existed. Still, even at the height of its power, danger slowly approached from the west. Because beyond Greece, a new conqueror was rising. A young king from Macedonia whose ambition would soon bring fire to the heart of Persia itself. His name was Alexander. By the 4th century BCE, the Persian Empire stood as the greatest superpower of the ancient world. Its territory stretched across continents. Its wealth filled legendary cities. Its kings ruled over millions. For generations, Persia had seemed nearly invincible. But beyond its western borders, a young conqueror was preparing to change history forever. His name was Alexander of Macedon. Later generations would call him Alexander the Great. Raised upon stories of heroes and conquest, Alexander inherited the powerful Macedonian army built by his father, King Philip II. Brilliant, ambitious, and fearless, he dreamed not merely of victory, but of creating an empire greater than any before him. And to achieve that dream he would march directly into Persia. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor with a relatively small but highly disciplined army. At first, many believed the Persian Empire would crush the invasion easily. Persia possessed enormous resources, vast manpower, and centuries of imperial experience. But the empire had begun weakening from within. Political instability, regional tensions, and internal struggles had slowly eroded the strength that once held the empire together. Meanwhile, Alexander moved with astonishing speed and military brilliance. Battle after battle, Persian defenses collapsed. At the Battle of Issus, Alexander defeated King Darius III himself, forcing the Persian ruler to flee the battlefield. Soon after, major cities began falling one by one beneath Macedonian control. Then Alexander marched toward the heart of Persia. Toward Persepolis. The ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire had stood for generations as the ultimate symbol of Persian glory. Its towering palaces, massive stairways, and golden halls represented the wealth and authority of the great kings. But in 330 BCE Persepolis fell. What happened next became one of the most famous and tragic moments in ancient history. Ancient sources describe fires consuming the palaces of Persepolis as flames illuminated the night sky. Some claimed Alexander burned the city intentionally as revenge for earlier Persian invasions of Greece. Others suggest the destruction emerged from drunken celebration and chaos. Whatever the cause, the symbolic impact was enormous. The great capital of Persia had been reduced to ruins. Soon after, Darius III was killed while fleeing eastward, marking the official collapse of the Achaemenid Empire. For the first time in centuries, Persia no longer ruled itself. Alexander declared himself king of Asia and absorbed the Persian Empire into his own rapidly expanding dominion. Yet unlike many conquerors, Alexander did not completely reject Persian culture. In fact, he became increasingly fascinated by it. He adopted elements of Persian royal ceremony, wore aspects of Persian clothing, and even encouraged marriages between Macedonians and Persians. Many of his own officers deeply resented these actions, believing Alexander was becoming too Persian. But Alexander seemed determined to merge worlds together. Greek and Persian influences began blending across the empire in ways never seen before. Then suddenly everything changed. In 323 BCE, Alexander died unexpectedly in Babylon at only 32 years old. His empire shattered almost immediately. Without a clear successor, his generals divided the conquered territories among themselves, creating competing kingdoms. In Persia and much of the Eastern Empire, power eventually fell to the Seleucid dynasty, founded by one of Alexander's generals, Seleucus I. The Seleucids attempted to continue Alexander's vision of a Hellenistic world dominated by Greek culture. Greek cities were established across Iranian lands. Greek language spread through administration and trade. Greek art, philosophy, and architecture influenced urban life. For a time, it appeared the ancient Persian world might slowly dissolve into a new Hellenistic civilization. But beneath the surface, Iranian identity endured. Far from disappearing, Persian traditions survived within villages, noble families, local customs, and regional cultures spread across the plateau. The memory of earlier empires remained alive among the people. Language persisted. Religious traditions survived. Ancient concepts of kingship and Iranian identity continued evolving quietly beneath foreign rule. The Seleucid Empire itself also struggled to maintain control over such vast territories. Rebellions erupted. Distant provinces drifted beyond central authority. The further east one traveled, the weaker Greek influence often became. And deep within the eastern regions of the former empire, another power slowly began to rise. The Parthians. Originally an Iranian people from northeastern lands, they would eventually challenge Seleucid control and restore native Iranian rule over much of the plateau once again. History had entered another cycle. Empires rose. Empires collapsed. Conquerors arrived believing they could reshape civilizations forever. Yet the deeper identity of Iran continued surviving beneath every invasion, adapting across centuries without ever fully disappearing. Even after Persepolis burned. Even after the Persian Empire fell. The soul of Iran endured. After the fall of the Achaemenid Empire and centuries of Greek rule under the Seleucids, the ancient lands of Iran seemed transformed forever. Greek cities spread across the plateau. Hellenistic culture dominated royal courts. Alexander's successors ruled over territories once controlled by the great kings of Persia. Yet beneath foreign rule, Iranian identity had never truly disappeared. It waited. Quietly surviving in villages, noble families, tribal traditions, and eastern provinces far from the centers of Greek power. And from those distant eastern lands, a new Iranian force slowly began to rise. They were the Parthians. Originally connected to an Iranian people known as the Parnai, the Parthians emerged from the northeastern frontiers near the Caspian regions and gradually expanded into the weakening Seleucid territories. Their founder, Arsaces I, rebelled against Seleucid authority during the 3rd century BCE and established an independent kingdom that would eventually grow into one of the ancient world's greatest empires. At first, few could have imagined how powerful they would become. The Seleucid Empire still controlled enormous territories inherited from Alexander the Great. Greek culture remained dominant across many cities of the Near East. But the Seleucids faced endless internal struggles, rebellions, and wars over succession. Their empire stretched too far across too many lands. The Parthians recognized weakness when they saw it. Generation after generation, they expanded westward across Iran, slowly reclaiming territories once ruled by Persian kings centuries earlier. By the time of Mithridates I in the 2nd century BCE, the Parthians had conquered vast lands including Media, Mesopotamia, and major trade routes linking east and west. Iran was once again under Iranian rule. But the Parthian Empire differed greatly from the old Achaemenid system. The empire was decentralized and heavily dependent upon powerful noble families. Local rulers often retained significant autonomy as long as they remained loyal to the Arsacid kings. This flexibility helped the empire survive across enormous territories, though it also created internal instability at times. Still, the Parthians accomplished something remarkable. They restored Iranian political power after centuries of foreign domination. The empire that emerged became one of Rome's greatest rivals. To the west stood the growing Roman Republic, later transformed into the Roman Empire. Between Rome and Parthia stretched centuries of rivalry, diplomacy, and brutal warfare. Mesopotamia and Armenia became contested frontiers where two superpowers struggled for influence. And unlike many enemies Rome faced, the Parthians proved extraordinarily difficult to conquer. Their military became legendary throughout the ancient world. Parthian warfare relied heavily on cavalry, swift horse archers capable of attacking enemies from great distances before vanishing across open terrain. Heavily armored cataphracts charged with devastating force while mounted archers surrounded opposing armies with relentless waves of arrows. Roman legions, masters of infantry warfare, often struggled against these tactics. One battle became especially infamous. In 53 BCE, Roman general Crassus invaded Parthian territory expecting an easy victory. Instead, at the Battle of Carrhae, Parthian horse archers annihilated much of the Roman army in one of Rome's greatest military disasters. The victory shocked the Roman world. For centuries afterward, Rome and Parthia remained locked in rivalry across the eastern frontier. Meanwhile, the Parthians controlled one of the ancient world's greatest economic lifelines: the Silk Road. Trade caravans carrying silk, spices, precious metals, glass, and exotic goods crossed Parthian lands between China, India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world. This position brought enormous wealth to the empire and transformed Parthian cities into centers of commerce and cultural exchange. Within the empire itself, cultures blended together. Greek influences from the Hellenistic age mixed with Iranian traditions. Religious diversity flourished. Local customs survived alongside broader imperial identity. Parthian art, clothing, and architecture reflected this fusion of worlds. And despite centuries of conquest and foreign influence, Iranian civilization endured once again beneath its own rulers. Yet the Parthian Empire was never fully stable. Power struggles among noble families weakened central authority. Rival kings sometimes competed for the throne simultaneously. Roman invasions repeatedly threatened Western territories. Gradually, cracks began forming within the empire. And in southern Iran, another dynasty slowly prepared to challenge Parthian rule. A dynasty that would claim not merely to rule Iran, but to restore the ancient glory of Persia itself. They were the Sassanids. And under them, the word Iran would rise once again with greater power than ever. For centuries, the Iranian world had endured conquest, foreign rule, and endless war. The Achaemenid Empire had fallen beneath Alexander's armies. The Seleucids brought Greek influence across the plateau. The Parthians restored Iranian power but ruled through a loose and decentralized system often weakened by internal conflict. Then, in the 3rd century CE, a new dynasty emerged from southern Iran determined not merely to rule the land, but to restore the ancient glory of Persia itself. They were the Sassanids. And under them, the ancient identity of Iran would rise once again with unprecedented strength. The founder of the dynasty was Ardashir I, a ruler from the region of Pars, the ancestral homeland of the Persians. Rising against the weakened Parthian Empire, Ardashir defeated the last Parthian king in battle and established a new imperial order in 224 CE. But unlike the fragmented Parthian system, Ardashir envisioned something far more centralized and powerful. He sought to rebuild a unified Iranian empire. The Sassanids viewed themselves as heirs to the ancient Achaemenids, the empire once founded by Cyrus the Great centuries earlier. They revived old Persian traditions, strengthened royal authority, and promoted a renewed vision of Iranian identity across the empire. Most importantly, the Sassanids officially used the name Iran in imperial ideology and royal inscriptions. Their empire became known as Iranshar, meaning realm of the Iranians, or Empire of Iran. This was one of the earliest major state uses of the word that would eventually become modern Iran. To the outside world, especially in the West, the empire was still commonly called Persia because of its Persian ruling dynasty. But internally, The Sassanids increasingly promoted the concept of a broader Iranian civilization uniting many peoples beneath one imperial identity. This idea would survive for centuries. Under the Sassanids, imperial power became highly centralized around the Shahanshah, the king of kings. Massive bureaucracies governed provinces across the empire. Noble families retained influence, but royal authority expanded far beyond what the Parthians had achieved. And with centralized rule came monumental ambition. The Sassanids constructed enormous palaces, fortified cities, bridges, canals, and temples across their empire. Their architecture reflected imperial confidence and artistic mastery. Vast audience halls supported by gigantic arches rose across Mesopotamia and Iran. One structure became especially famous: the Tak Kasra at Ctesiphon. Its colossal arch stood among the largest single-span brick vaults ever built in the ancient world, a symbol of Sassanid engineering and royal power. Religion also became deeply connected to the state. The Sassanids strongly promoted Zoroastrianism as the empire's official religion. Sacred fire temples spread across Iranian lands. Priests gained enormous influence within government and society. Ancient Iranian spiritual traditions were organized and formalized more systematically than before. The religion emphasized truth, order, and the eternal struggle between good and evil. For the Sassanid rulers, protecting Iran was not only political, it was sacred. Yet the empire was never culturally isolated. Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Manichaeans, and many other communities lived within Sassanid territories. Trade routes connected the empire to India, Central Asia, China, and the Mediterranean world. Persian art, textiles, music, and ideas spread far beyond Iran's borders. At its height, the Sassanid Empire became one of the greatest superpowers of late antiquity. Only one rival stood equal to it: Rome. Later, the Byzantine Empire. For centuries, the Romans and Sassanids fought brutal wars across Mesopotamia, Armenia, and the Near East. Massive armies clashed repeatedly along fortified frontiers. Cities changed hands. Emperors and kings competed for prestige, territory, and influence over the ancient world. One Sassanid ruler shocked Rome itself. Shapur I defeated the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle and captured him alive, one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. Sassanid relief carvings proudly depicted the Roman emperor kneeling before the Persian king. The rivalry between Rome and Iran shaped the ancient world for generations. But war also carried immense cost. Endless military campaigns exhausted resources and weakened stability. Internal political struggles intensified over time. Noble factions competed for power. Economic pressures mounted. Religious tensions occasionally erupted within society. Still, culturally, the Sassanid age represented a golden era of pre-Islamic Iranian civilization. Persian literature flourished. Imperial art reached extraordinary sophistication. Court rituals, royal imagery, and political traditions influenced later Islamic empires for centuries to come. Even after the Sassanids disappeared, their legacy would survive deeply within Iranian culture and beyond. Many historians consider the Sassanid Empire the final great expression of ancient Iran before the coming of Islam. And yet, despite its strength, danger was already emerging from the south. Across the Arabian deserts, a new religious movement had begun transforming tribal societies into a unified force driven by faith and expansion. Within only a few decades, this new power would shatter the Sassanid world forever. Fire temples would fall silent. Ancient kingship would collapse. And Iran would enter one of the greatest transformations in its entire history. By the 7th century CE, the Sassanid Empire stood exhausted after generations of devastating war against the Byzantine Empire. Cities had been drained of wealth. Armies weakened by endless conflict struggled to defend vast frontiers. Political instability spread across the empire as rival nobles competed for power around a fragile throne. The once mighty empire of Iran was weakening from within. And beyond its southern deserts, a new force was rising with extraordinary speed. In Arabia, the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad had united many previously divided Arab tribes beneath the banner of Islam. What began as a spiritual movement rapidly transformed into a powerful civilization driven by faith, expansion, and political unity. Within only a few decades after the Prophet's death, Arab-Muslim armies surged beyond Arabia into neighboring empires. The Byzantine Empire faced invasions in the west. The Sassanid Empire faced catastrophe in the east. At first, many Persian nobles underestimated the threat. The Arabs came from lands long considered poor and fragmented compared to the great civilizations surrounding them. But the Muslim armies moved with discipline, momentum, and religious conviction. Meanwhile, Iran itself was deeply vulnerable. The Sassanid state had become unstable after years of internal chaos. Kings rose and fell rapidly. Noble families fought among themselves. Economic hardships spread across provinces already damaged by war and plague. Then came the decisive battles. In 636 CE, Arab-Muslim forces defeated the Sassanid army at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, one of the most important turning points in Middle Eastern history. Soon after, the Persians suffered another devastating defeat at Nahavand, later remembered by some Muslim historians as the victory of victories. The road into the Iranian heartland now lay open. One by one major cities fell. Ctesiphon, the magnificent Sassanid capital, was captured. Royal treasuries vanished into the hands of the conquerors. Fire temples were abandoned or transformed. And finally, the last Sassanid king, Yazdijerd III, fled eastward before being killed years later far from the empire his ancestors once ruled. The Sassanid Empire had collapsed. For the first time in centuries, Iran was ruled by a foreign religious and political power. Yet unlike some earlier conquests, the Arab conquest did not erase Iranian civilization. Instead, something more complex began to happen. At first, many Iranians resisted Arab rule. Zoroastrian traditions remained strong in several regions, and conversion to Islam happened gradually over generations rather than instantly. In many areas, Persian culture survived beneath the new Islamic political system. And slowly, Iran itself began transforming Islam from within. Persian administrators, scholars, poets, scientists, and intellectuals became deeply influential across the growing Islamic world. The Arabs had conquered Iran militarily, but Iranian civilization would profoundly shape the future of Islamic culture. The Persian language survived. This was one of the most important developments in Iranian history. Although Arabic became the language of religion and scholarship across much of the Islamic world, Persian re-emerged as a major literary and cultural language under later Islamic dynasties. Over time, new Persian written in Arabic script flourished across courts, cities, and intellectual centers. Persian poetry became legendary. Writers such as Ferdowsi, whose epic Shahnameh preserved ancient Iranian myths and history, helped ensure that pre-Islamic Persian identity would never fully disappear. The Shahnameh remembered ancient kings, heroes, and legends stretching back into the age of Persia itself. It became more than literature. It became cultural memory. Meanwhile, Iranian scholars played central roles during the Islamic Golden Age. Persian thinkers contributed enormously to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, architecture, and science across the medieval Islamic world. Cities such as Nishapur, Isfahan, Ray, and later Baghdad became centers of intellectual brilliance shaped heavily by Persian influence. Even politically, Iranian traditions survived. Successive Islamic dynasties ruling Iran often adopted Persian court customs, administrative systems, royal symbolism, and concepts of kingship inherited from earlier empires. Over time, Persian culture spread far beyond Iran itself into Central Asia, South Asia, and the wider Islamic world. This fusion created something entirely new: an Islamic Iranian civilization. Iran was no longer the Zoroastrian empire of the Sassanids, yet neither had it become culturally Arab. Instead, Iranian identity adapted and survived through transformation. The old world had ended, but the civilization endured. Still, Iran's future would remain turbulent. New invaders would arrive from the steppes of Central Asia. Turkic dynasties would seize power. And then, centuries later, one of the most terrifying forces in human history would descend upon the Islamic world itself: the Mongols. Once again, Iran would face destruction. Once again, it would survive. After the Arab conquest transformed Iran into part of the Islamic world, centuries passed beneath constantly changing dynasties. Yet despite invasions, revolutions, and political collapse, Iranian civilization continued adapting and surviving through each new era. But beginning in the medieval period, Iran would face some of the most devastating invasions in its entire history. First came the Turks, then the Mongols, and finally the terrifying armies of Timur. Each wave reshaped the land forever. By the 11th century, Turkic peoples from Central Asia had become dominant across much of the Islamic world. Among them rose the Seljuks, a powerful Turkic dynasty that conquered Iran, Iraq, and surrounding regions. Though foreign in origin, the Seljuks quickly adopted many elements of Persian culture and administration. In fact, Persian civilization became so influential that many Turkic rulers governed through Persian language, literature, court traditions, and bureaucracy. Persian poets, scholars, and administrators flourished under Seljuk rule. Cities such as Isfahan became major centers of Islamic learning, art, and architecture. Once again, Iran adapted foreign conquerors into its own cultural world. But beyond the eastern horizon, a far greater storm was approaching. In the early 13th century, the Mongols exploded outward from the steppes under the leadership of Genghis Khan. Their armies moved with terrifying speed across Asia, destroying kingdoms that had stood for centuries. Entire cities vanished beneath fire and massacre. Survivors described the invasions as the end of the world itself. At first, the Mongols did not intend to conquer Iran completely. Trade disputes and the killing of Mongol envoys by the Khwarezmian ruler triggered the conflict that would unleash catastrophe upon the region. Genghis Khan responded with overwhelming fury. What followed became one of the greatest disasters in Iranian history. Cities such as Nishapur, Merv, Herat, and Tus were devastated. Ancient centers of learning and trade collapsed beneath Mongol assaults. Libraries burned. Irrigation systems were destroyed. Entire populations were slaughtered in campaigns of terrifying brutality. The old Islamic world that had flourished across Iran and Central Asia shattered beneath the invasion. For many people living at the time, it seemed civilization itself was ending. Yet even after such destruction, Iran endured once again. Over time, the Mongols established a ruling dynasty in Iran known as the Ilkhanate. At first, the Mongol rulers remained culturally distant from the societies they governed. But gradually, something remarkable happened. The conquerors themselves began transforming. Mongol rulers adopted Islam. Persian administrators rebuilt systems of government. Iranian scholars returned to positions of influence. Persian art, literature, science, and architecture experienced revival under later Ilkhanid rulers despite the horrors of the invasion. One ruler in particular, Ghazan Khan, attempted major reforms to stabilize the devastated empire. Taxes were reorganized. Agriculture was restored. Trade revived across parts of the Silk Road. Observatories, buildings, and intellectual institutions once again appeared across Iranian lands. Even after unimaginable destruction, Iranian civilization adapted and survived. But peace would not last. In the 14th century, another conqueror emerged from Central Asia claiming the legacy of both Genghis Khan and the ancient world conquerors before him. His name was Timur. Known in the West as Tamerlane, Timur was a Turco-Mongol warlord of extraordinary military ability and terrifying ambition. From his base in Central Asia, he launched campaigns across Persia, Mesopotamia, India, Anatolia, and beyond. His armies conquered enormous territories with ruthless efficiency. Cities that resisted him often faced horrific punishment. Massacres followed many of his victories. Towering pyramids of skulls became symbols of his campaigns. Iran once again descended into violence and instability beneath another wave of conquest. Yet Timur was not merely a destroyer. Like many rulers before him, he deeply admired Persian culture. Persian became a major language of administration, literature, and court life within the Timurid Empire. Timurid cities such as Samarkand and Herat later became centers of art, architecture, astronomy, and scholarship influenced heavily by Persian civilization. This contradiction defined much of Iran's medieval history. Foreign dynasties repeatedly conquered the land, and then slowly became Persianized themselves. Turkic rulers adopted Persian bureaucracy. Mongol conquerors embraced Persian culture and Islam. Timurid courts celebrated Persian poetry and art. Again and again, Iranian civilization survived not by remaining unchanged, but by absorbing and transforming those who ruled it. Still, political fragmentation continued weakening the region after Timur's death. Rival dynasties competed for power across Iran. Instability spread through the land once more. But from this chaos, a new dynasty would eventually emerge. One that would reunite Iran politically, reshape its religious identity forever, and lay the foundations of the modern Iranian state itself. They were the Safavids. And under them, Iran would rise once again as a unified empire. By the end of the medieval age, Iran had survived centuries of invasion, fragmentation, and foreign dynasties. Arabs, Turks, Mongols, and Timurids had all ruled the land in different eras. Cities had burned. Empires had collapsed. Dynasties had risen and vanished into history. Yet beneath every conquest, the deeper identity of Iran endured. And in the early 16th century, that identity would rise once again with extraordinary force. From the northwestern city of Ardabil emerged a young leader named Ismail. He was barely a teenager when he began gathering followers beneath a powerful religious and political movement known as the Safavid order. Originally a Sufi spiritual brotherhood, The movement gradually transformed into a militant force fueled by devotion, messianic belief and fierce loyalty. Ismail's warriors, known as the Qizilbash because of their distinctive red headgear, believed their leader carried divine destiny. In 1501, Ismail captured the city of Tabriz and declared himself Shah of Iran. For the first time in centuries, much of the Iranian plateau was being unified beneath a native dynasty once again. The Safavid Empire had begun. But Ismail's revolution was not only political, it was religious. At the time, most of Iran's population remained Sunni Muslim, like much of the broader Islamic world. Yet Ismail made a decision that would permanently reshape Iranian identity forever. He declared Twelver Shurism the official religion of the state. This transformation changed the course of Iranian history. Through state support, religious institutions, and at times brutal enforcement, Shurism gradually spread across Iran over generations. Scholars from Arab Sharia centers were invited into the empire to establish seminaries and religious authority. Mosques, rituals, mourning traditions and religious scholarship rooted in Sharia Islam became central to public life. The result was profound. Iran became spiritually distinct from its major Sunni neighbors, especially the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Uzbek states to the east. This religious identity would eventually become one of the defining foundations of modern Iran itself. Yet the Safavids were more than religious reformers. They were empire builders. Ismail and his successors gradually expanded control across much of Iran, Iraq, the Caucasus, and surrounding territories. Though the empire faced devastating wars against the Ottomans, the Safavids succeeded in rebuilding a centralized Iranian state after centuries of instability. One battle, however, nearly shattered the empire early in its history. In 1514, Ottoman Sultan Selim I defeated Shah Ismail at the Battle of Calderon using superior gunpowder weapons and artillery. The defeat shocked the Safavids and permanently changed warfare in the region. But the empire survived. And under later rulers, especially Shah Abbas I, the Safavid state reached extraordinary heights. Shah Abbas transformed Iran into one of the great powers of the early modern world. He reorganized the military, strengthened centralized authority, expanded trade routes, and turned the city of Isfahan into one of the most magnificent capitals on earth. European travelers arriving in Safavid Iran described Isfahan with amazement. Grand mosques covered in blue tile work reflected sunlight like jewels. Vast public squares filled with merchants, scholars, diplomats and artisans from across Asia and Europe. Bridges crossed elegant rivers beneath gardens and palaces designed with astonishing beauty. One Persian phrase became famous. Isfahan is half the world. The Safavid Empire stood at the center of global trade connecting Europe, India, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Persian carpets, silk, miniature paintings, metalwork, and architecture became celebrated across continents. Persian culture flourished once again. Poetry thrived. Science and philosophy continued developing. And the Persian language spread influence far beyond Iran itself into Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. Most importantly, the Safavid era helped solidify the idea of Iran as a unified political and cultural civilization. Earlier dynasties had ruled Iranian lands, but the Safavids created something closer to the recognizable foundations of modern Iran. Their combination of centralized monarchy, Persian culture, and Sharia religious identity left a lasting imprint that survives even today. To outsiders, the country was still widely known as Persia. But internally, the memory of Iran, the land of the Iranians, had fully returned. Yet beneath the empire's beauty, tensions remained. Wars against the Ottomans drained resources. Court intrigues weakened rulers after Shah Abbas. Tribal rivalries and political corruption slowly destabilized the empire. And eventually, after more than 2 centuries of Safavid rule, the empire entered decline. But despite its collapse, the Safavid legacy endured long afterward, because they had accomplished something historic. They reunited Iran. They reshaped its religious identity. And they ensured that the idea of Iran would survive into the modern age not merely as a memory of ancient Persia, but as a living civilization reborn. By the 19th century, the once mighty Safavid Empire had long vanished, and Iran entered a turbulent age under the Qajar dynasty. Though the Qajars ruled over a land rich in history and culture, the country itself faced growing weakness, internal corruption, economic hardship, and increasing foreign interference. Powerful empires surrounding Iran, especially Britain and Russia, competed for influence over the region, turning the country into a battleground of political pressure known later as the Great Game. Large territories were lost through humiliating wars and treaties. Foreign powers gained control over trade, resources, and financial concessions inside Iran. Many Iranians viewed the Qajar rulers as ineffective and unable to defend the nation's independence. While Europe industrialized rapidly, Iran struggled with instability and underdevelopment. Yet during this difficult era, a new sense of Iranian nationalism slowly began to emerge. Intellectuals, reformers, poets, and political activists increasingly looked back toward Iran's ancient past, toward Cyrus, Persepolis, and the pre-Islamic empires, as symbols of national pride and unity. Many believed the country needed modernization and stronger centralized leadership to survive in the modern world. Then, in the early 20th century, a military officer named Reza Khan rose to power. Strong, disciplined, and ambitious, Reza Khan eventually seized control of the government and in 1925 crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, founding the Pahlavi dynasty. His goal was nothing less than transforming Iran into a modern nation-state. Reza Shah launched massive reforms across the country. Roads, railways, factories, schools, and government institutions expanded rapidly. Tribal revolts were suppressed and centralized authority strengthened. Western-style legal systems and modern military structures were introduced. Traditional clothing regulations changed, and efforts were made to reduce foreign influence inside the country. But alongside modernization, Reza Shah also promoted a powerful vision of Iranian national identity rooted deeply in ancient history. He admired the grandeur of pre-Islamic Persia and sought to reconnect the modern nation with its ancient heritage. Archaeological projects highlighted ruins such as Persepolis, while national symbolism increasingly emphasized Iran's long imperial past. Then came one of the most symbolic moments in modern Iranian history. In 1935, Reza Shah formally requested that foreign governments stop using the name Persia in official communication and instead use the name Iran, the name already used by many people inside the country for centuries. Britannica.com. The decision surprised much of the world. For generations, Western nations had known the country primarily as Persia, a name inherited from the ancient Greeks, who identified the empire through the Persian homeland of Pars. But Iran came from a much older native term connected to the idea of the land of the Aryans, or land of the Iranians. Britannica.com. Officially, Persia became Iran. Yet culturally the older name never fully disappeared. Even today many people continue using Persia when referring to the country's ancient civilization, art, poetry, carpets, and imperial history, while Iran represents the modern nation-state born from thousands of years of survival, transformation, and identity. The name had changed, but the civilization behind it had endured across millennia. Across deserts, mountains, ruined palaces, burning cities, and forgotten empires, one truth has remained constant through thousands of years of history. Iran never truly disappeared. The world may have called it Persia for centuries, a name born from Greek encounters with the mighty Achaemenid Empire, but beneath every conquest and transformation, the deeper identity of Iran endured. From the ancient tribes of the Iranian plateau to the empires of Cyrus, the Sassanids, the Safavids, and the modern nation-state itself, the story was never simply about a change of name. It was about survival. Civilizations across history have vanished completely. Their languages disappeared. Their cultures dissolved into memory. Their cities became dust beneath the earth. Yet Iran survived invasions that shattered empires. Greeks, Arabs, Turks, Mongols, and countless dynasties ruled the land across different eras, but none erased the civilization beneath it. Instead, Iran adapted. It absorbed conquerors into its culture. It transformed foreign rulers into guardians of Persian language, art, literature, and identity. Again and again the civilization reinvented itself while preserving its ancient soul. This is why the story of Persia becoming Iran is far more than a political event from 1935. The official adoption of the name Iran, under Reza Shah, simply revealed to the outside world what had existed internally for centuries. The people of the land had long known themselves through versions of the name Iran, rooted in the ancient idea of the land of the Iranians. Meanwhile, Persia survived as the Western memory of one extraordinary chapter within that much larger story. Even today both names still carry powerful meaning. Persia evokes images of Persepolis, Cyrus the Great, poetry, carpets, gardens, and ancient imperial glory. Iran represents a living nation that continues carrying that inheritance into the modern world. Two names, one civilization. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden within this journey across millennia. Nations are not defined only by borders or governments. They are shaped by memory, by language, by culture, by by stories passed from generation to generation long after kings and empires fall. From the sacred fires of the Zoroastrians to the mosques of Isfahan. From the armies of Cyrus to the poetry of Ferdowsi. From Persepolis to modern Tehran. The spirit of Iran has endured through every age of history. Empires rose and vanished. Maps changed. Dynasties collapsed. But the civilization remained alive. And so, whether the world calls it Persia or Iran, the story continues, not as the tale of a lost nation, but as one of humanity's oldest surviving civilizations, still carrying the echoes of its ancient past into the future.